great to be with you here this morning. What we're going to discuss here is not going to be a quiet morning in Washington, as we all know. And thank you for the Ripon Society for allowing me to start the day in the calmest, quietest setting that I will see all day long. Since I was first elected, addressing the issues facing patients, as Jonathan pointed out, and constituents, it was the number one agenda item that I would address. Before I was elected, you're right, Jonathan, I worked with my wife, who I talked to every morning and every evening walking up to the Hill, and she was on her way into continue practicing. So I have pillow talk that is different than most people's pillow talk. I'm proud to serve on Energy and Commerce. It was a goal of mine. Earlier in this Congress, I was proud to introduce bipartisan legislation with Congresswoman Berrigan to require the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid to consider covering new and innovative treatments when enough data is collected on drugs' effectiveness. This legislation will ensure that new treatments become available when the CMS considers each drug individually to determine that it should be covered by Medicare. Importantly, the Access to Innovative Treatments Act would support the more than 280,000 Pennsylvanians who have been diagnosed with Alzheimer's by offering the ability to potentially obtain medications that could slow or halt the progression of this disease by slowing or halting the deposition of amyloid, which is one of the affiliations, one of the associations that we see in brains with those with Alzheimer's disease. Last year, the FDA granted accelerated approval of the drug Leqembi, the second of innovative and new category of monoclonal antibody therapy for the treatment of early-stage Alzheimer's disease. I think we all recognize that the earlier that an individual is diagnosed and the earlier that an individual goes into treatment, that prolongs the time span before they require aggressive care, before they require family members to often leave their jobs, before they require nursing home or dementia stage units to be able to provide their care. This innovation is not inexpensive, but this innovation is what we need to prevent the number one cost of healthcare in America today, and that's Alzheimer's disease. Following this, the Veterans Health Administration announced that they will provide coverage for Leqembi. And in sharp contrast to that, CMS policy continues to tightly regulate and restrict access to an FDA-approved treatment for people living with Alzheimer's disease. And despite providing data demonstrating that the clinical effectiveness of new monoclonal antibody therapies for the treatment of Alzheimer's disease, since the release of its decision last year, CMS continues to deny members of Congress requests and stakeholders' requests to change that coverage policy. The Veterans Administration has deemed it accessible and acceptable and approved it. The Veterans Administration provides that for veterans who receive their health care and their prescriptions through the VA, and yet CMS turns it back to this problem. They don't address this, and they leave families suffering from this as we all sit here this morning. It is time to force the CMS to change that policy and to ensure that life-saving and life-altering medications like this monoclonal antibody are available and accessed by those who need them the most. I want to address, and Jonathan alluded to this as far as the practice of medicine. When I graduated from medical school, it was the same year that the Orphan Drug Act came into play. The Orphan Drug Act really guided my career and the ability to provide therapies and cures and treatments for medicines that, for diseases that previously had no medicines or ability to be treated or cured. I practiced dermatology for 25 years with my wife. And as recently as 7 to 8 years ago, when you'd see someone and they had a lesion on their skin, it was highly suspicious for melanoma. You do the excision and you do an exam. You palpate for nodes. You'd see if there were any swollen nodes. If they had swollen nodes, you would take that next step and you'd refer them to a surgeon for a lymph node biopsy, maybe even a lymph node dissection in certain cases. If the lymph nodes came back positive and if the imaging tests came back positive, then they were referred to an oncologist. And honestly, in pretty short order, many of these patients, more than 50 to 60% in our practice, were subsequently referred to hospice care within the first 2 months of diagnosis. The Orphan Drug Act opened new doors, new treatments, and truly brave new therapies that we saw developed, like Keytruda. Jimmy Carter, former president of the United States, currently in full remission from melanoma. And he was very public about his melanoma because it presented with metastatic disease, Mets to the brain, which is one of the most life-altering and life-devastating diagnoses that occurs with melanoma. Jimmy Carter was treated in the first year when Keytruda was released. His melanoma has resolved, and he is in full remission. His wife actually has now preceded him in death. But this innovation would never have occurred without the Orphan Drugs Act. When we look at what the Orphan Drug Act did, it addresses a serious threat of the 10,000 diseases that are classified as rare diseases. And 95% of that 10,000 still don't have any treatments or still don't have any cures. The narrow IRA, which was recently passed, carves out for orphan disease medications, and it threatens the continued production of these new therapies. So I look at the medical students, and like I said, when I go home, I talk to medical students all the time. We have programs that try to bring medical students back to our district, so they end up practicing there. But when I talk to them and see that they're going to be stifled by the IRA, that what I was able to practice and see the evolution of treatments and cures because of the Orphan Drug Act, I'm not going to have that access. In direct response to this, I have introduced the Orphan Cures Act, which would expand the Orphan Drug Act exemption to cover multiple orphan indications involving rare diseases and cancers. So I'm going to give you some instances of things that are rare diseases, and you make a decision of how rare you think those are. Ovarian cancer. Melanoma is still on that list. Cystic fibrosis. These are diseases that are classified because of the fewer number of individuals who have those. But again, there are more than 600 drugs that have been developed because of the Orphan Drug Act, and we're stifling that with a specific problem in the IRA. And so the Orphan Cures Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation, which I have members from the other side of the aisle, a member from ENC who recognizes that we can no longer allow this to occur, that Americans expect and deserve the innovation from what they have when addressing diseases. I came to Congress with a very specific focus. I ran in a very crowded initial open primary. I was the last candidate to jump in on that primary. My wife and I had attended 2 of the forums when the candidates, all of them guys, all of them announced, and I said, what are your top 3 agenda items? No one mentioned health care. I went back to a second one. I said, where's health care on your agenda item? Well, you know, they pandered to me. As a physician, they ruled that in. They knew that I was someone who had contributed to them in the past. But by the time we left that second forum and we're driving home, my wife was saying to me, if you don't do this, if you don't run for this position now, you're not going to be able to have the impact that you could as running for an open seat. I like to come to Washington and work in a bipartisan fashion. I think that I'm working with several members, specifically Congressman Wiley Nickel from North Carolina, and making sure that legislation comes to the floor regarding the Orphan Cures Act is one of my top priorities in this Congress. I also wanted to address, in a similar vein to the Orphan Cures Act, the Mini Act, which narrowly targets in utilizing genetically targeted technologies, or GTTs. GTTs were defined for the first time in the 21st Century Cures Act and captured 2 specific categories of therapies: small interfering RNA and antisense oligonucleotides. I didn't want to make this a chemistry lesson for people this morning, but you've got to understand that these siRNAs and these GTTs are in their infancy, and these are going to be the wave of future therapies, and we have to be able to protect them, but subjecting them to the highly complex small molecule drugs in a negotiation timeline intended for really simpler and smaller drugs, and it will disproportionately impact the innovation and the ability to bring these new drugs to market. These are drugs that are going to be affecting people with leukemia and lymphoma. These are drugs that need to be in the developmental stage and not held to these higher restrictions. So ultimately, legislation like the Orphan Cures Act and the Mini Act are designed to bring more treatments, more cures, and more innovations to patients and to my constituents. And while an individual rare disease, like I said, only impacts 200,000 people or less, over 31 million Americans are impacted by these diseases in the aggregate. 31 million people are waiting for Congress to act, and that action is voting on and passing and signing into law the Orphan Cares Act. Another piece of legislation I want to talk that I'm a proud co-sponsor of is H.R. 1691, the Ensuring Patient Access to Critical Breakthrough Products. This bill would establish an expedited pathway of 4 years of transitional Medicare fee-for-service coverage for medical devices that are approved and cleared by the FDA with breakthrough status. And under this legislation, not only would CMS be required to establish a payment code within 3 months of an FDA approval, but they would also be directly responsible to make a permanent decision on coverage within a 4-year transitional period. 4 years. That should definitely give the FDA enough time to bring this through. Once a medical device is deemed safe and effective by the FDA, we can't allow the bureaucratic process to delay a senior citizen's ability to access the best care that is available. That best care has always been in the United States. That best care should not be having individuals have to go to a foreign country to access something that is already FDA approved. Breakthrough technologies should not be kept away from a patient just because they're in a Medicare plan. I am very hopeful that we'll see this legislation make it to the President's desk during this Congress, and have been proud to support MSET legislation in the past. The current legislation uncertainty regarding coverage decisions of innovative products not only harms the patient access, but it also jeopardizes research and development of new devices. The TSET pathway proposed by the Biden CMS offers no certainty to a device and when that might receive the ultimate referral. So to summarize, I want you to think of me as a physician, as a legislator, and as someone who came to Washington to allow innovation to continue to progress, because American individuals, American patients, American constituents expect that innovation. They have access to that by being able to look online and see what's available. But if you're the practitioner, if you're the doctor sitting in the office saying, this is a great new Alzheimer's drug, I'd love for you to have it, I'd love for your parents to have that, but Medicare isn't approving that drug. But, oh, by the way, is your mom or dad a vet? Can they go to the VA because it's approved over there? We have to once again step up and allow innovation to be the cornerstone of American medicine. And Congress has a role in that. Congress, specifically through Energy and Commerce, must allow that innovation to occur. Yesterday, Tiffany and I were talking, and she told me that I shouldn't conclude this discussion without addressing artificial intelligence. And we briefly had a conversation here this morning as we were talking. And artificial intelligence is already integrated in so much of the research and development of therapies as are going on. I want to briefly address how I feel artificial intelligence needs to be innovated and be part of your physician's training, your physician's care, and you as a patient, how that has to be important as well. When I meet with medical students, Pennsylvania has the third largest number of medical schools of all the states in the union, third largest number. And I see students from top tier schools like University of Pennsylvania, Jefferson, Temple, University of Pittsburgh, and ask them, do you have AI training? Is that part of your training? And the answers are all over the board. No, AI isn't, why would AI be part of our training? Yes, it's integrated into how we do physical exams, how we dialogue, how we talk to patients. You ask patients for consent when you walk into a room that you're going to be using an AI algorithm as part of their evaluation. Why would I ask for consent? These are questions that we in Congress need to step up and be able to understand. Do the patients return, the students who have that access, the residents who have access to AI as part of their evaluation? Do the patients ask you where that information is held, how that information is cataloged? These are all questions. We are steep on the learning curve with AI in medicine. We recognize that in medical devices and in pharmaceuticals that AI is being vastly utilized and should be. And it allows that information to be cultivated and processed. So I just recently met with a radiologist, a chief resident at the University of Pittsburgh. And In mammography, artificial intelligence is frequently used. The mammography is screening with it. This is the chief resident, the top dog of the training program at University of Pittsburgh. Question, what are you guys doing with AI? I don't like AI. Well, that's an interesting response. And the worst thing is to say why, but I'm like, what is your experience with AI? He said, every one of these mammograms need to have a physician that's available to review what's going on. And I said, but if there's a screening process that can allow you to have arrows pointing to areas that are suspicious, that have been diagnosed having cultivated multiple mammograms in the past, don't you think you're going to have a higher ability to diagnose earlier breast cancers and allow individuals to have treatments earlier, better survival rates, less chemotherapy? Talked about him regarding that. And I think by the end of the conversation, he said, yeah, I'm seeing where there could be a role in this, but I think that every mammogram, if it is my wife, my mom, my sister, I think they should have a physician reviewing that. Physicians and people in medicine are concerned that they're giving up part of their ability to be in charge. You have to be able to utilize all the tools in your tool belt. And AI, whether it is in mammography, whether it is in a pathology lab, whether it's in your evaluation, when you go in and you have that one-on-one with a physician, whether it's your primary care doctor or your specialist, I think you should be aware of AI as part of that discussion and how that information is being cataloged, charted, and the most important question is, who has access to it? How's it being held? Where is it being held? How do you access that information as well? These are all questions that, as I said earlier, we are steep on the learning curve here in the Congress to be able to do that. But that is in the lane of the Health Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce. And that is something that, and I'm first to admit that I am steep on the learning curve. That's why I have guys like Matt Tucker who give me articles to read and fills my inbox with, hey, have you seen this? Have you listened to this? Are you aware that this is being discussed? So recently, Matt and I, there's a pediatric cardiologist interventionist at Children's National here in DC. And there was an article in that highly scientific journal, The Washington Post, chronicling what he was doing. He has developed an AI program that evaluates cardiac echoes, a sonogram of the heart, for kids in Uganda. In Uganda, there's a high incidence of rheumatic heart disease. Rheumatic heart disease, when untreated, and it costs about $1.10's worth of penicillin to treat rheumatic heart disease. Those individuals who aren't treated with penicillin go on to develop valvular disease, need valve replacement. Mitral valve replacement is the most common for rheumatic heart disease. It was relatively common in the 50s and the 60s. We don't hear about it today in the United States very often because there are antibiotics to treat those, and pediatricians recognize it early and treat it. So what do you do with that information? He has developed a handheld cardiac echo. It's not a big machine that they wheel in the room, and has what he calls technicians, which are truly volunteers in Uganda, to go around, and if a clinician hears a heart murmur, that they have a cardiac echo, it is transferred and screened through AI, and then comes back to the United States, where he, as a pediatric interventional cardiologist, has the opportunity to review that and makes the decision of whether or not these individuals should have antibiotics, should have penicillin, if this represents rheumatic heart disease. So how does that transfer to a country doctor from Pennsylvania talking to a pediatric cardiologist, interventionalist in Washington? Because in my district, there are 0 interventional cardiologists in the field of pediatrics. So those individuals who might have a heart murmur and might have the opportunity to get an echo, it's not an expensive test, but they're going to be sent to CHOP in Philadelphia, or they're going to be sent to Children's in Pittsburgh, and they might go to Hershey Medical Center as well. But there's no one in Pennsylvania 13 who has that skill set to do that. So we're interested in how we take that information and how we make that information, that innovation, available in a pediatrics office, a pediatrician's office in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. Being able to understand that innovation is the cornerstone of what American patients and what American constituents expect. It allows me to keep that intellectual curiosity to be able to understand and share with others how important AI and the advancement of science on so many levels need to occur. But that cannot occur in many cases without government involvement, government improvement, and government succession to be able to see it occur. So I thank you, and I'm going to open it up for some questions, Jim, if we have time.
Tonight we're going to hear from President Biden, and from what I understand, he's calling for expansion of the IRA, an additional 50 drugs to be negotiated. He's also calling for applying the inflationary rebates in the commercial market, and also the $2,000 patient cap on drug costs in the commercial market as well. I think a lot of those types of proposals, while well intended, have real implications for coverage in the commercial market from employers. But those are the types of things we're seeing from Bernie Sanders, from Ron Wyden, from the Senate in general. And so I'll ask the same question I asked last August, with the Senate being where they are on healthcare issues, and the House taking a much more realistic approach and focusing on real policy change like the bills that you mentioned. I think we just saw a Band-Aid in I'll call it a funding bill, CR, but the legislation yesterday on healthcare, but we're yet to see this healthcare package. And so my question is, do you see daylight for a lame duck healthcare package? And if so, where would that land?
Let's address two different things. I read early this morning what they're saying Biden's going to release. Those sound to me like ideas that someone who's down 6 to 8 points in the poll is going to put out on their State of the Union address. That was my first look at it. I think that there is zero appetite on the Republican side of the House to pick up what they were putting down, if that comes to fruition in his discussion tonight. Second part of your question is what's going to happen with a health plan, health legislation, the lame duck issue. Jonathan, man, we're kicking a lot of cans down the road right now. I talked to Matt about this yesterday. We have a lame duck session that looks like there's more legislation than people are saying are going to occur there that's occurred year to date. Matt, correct? This was the discussion. Everything, it's lame duck, lame duck, lame duck. Like I said, I have one piece of legislation that I want to see come and be completed this year, and that's the Orphan Cures Act. A complete policy on health care. I am hesitant to see that that's going to move forward by the end of this conference.